Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prasthaya Bhutale Srimati Bhaktivedanta Swami Niti Namani Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Bacharani Nirvashesha Sanivari Vischacha Deshatani Namo Mahapananaya Krishna Prema Pratayate Krishnaya Krishna Chaitanya Namane Gauratashe Namaha. Thank you all for coming. I'm sure you're disappointed Shakti's not here. But she's having a little respiratory, so she asked me to fill in, and I'm extremely grateful to be able to help glorify Srila Prabhupada. She's prepared a beautiful slideshow. So all I have to do is read. It's quite easy. But when I see this first picture here, it's so touching for us because at the Hawaii temple, we were undergoing a difficult time, and Srila Prabhupada came and he cooked a big feast for us. So when I see this picture of Srila Prabhupada cooking, he knew how to cheer you up by cooking nice. It was the first time we ever tasted kachoris. It was in 1974. In the beginning of the year. I think it was January of 1974, and Srila Prabhupada made squash blossom pakoras. We'd never had them. Many things we had never had. We had never had poppers, and we had never had kachoris. So when I see the picture of Srila Prabhupada cooking, it makes me understand with great gratitude how much he cared about us and how he would come and he prepared everything himself. So I'm going to begin reading here, but I became immediately touched seeing this picture of Srila Prabhupada cooking. Keith, I saw that he was cooking, so I asked him if I could help. And he was very happy at the suggestion. The first couple of times he took me shopping, and after that, I mostly did it. He showed me how to make chapatis without a rolling pin by pressing out the dough with your fingers. Every day we would make chapatis, rice dal, and curries. Hopefully I know what I'm doing here. So Keith became the dependable cook and the housekeeper in Prabhupada's apartment. Meanwhile, at the Mott Street apartment, the roommates' favorite topic for discussion was their relationship with the Swami. Everyone thought it was a serious relationship. They knew Swami was Guru, and when they heard that he would be giving daily class at 6 a.m. up in his apartment, they were eager to attend. Keith said, I used to walk along the Bowery and look for flowers for him. When there were no flowers, I would take a straw or some grass. I loved going over there in the morning. Howard said, I would walk very briskly over to Swamiji's chanting Hare Krishna, feeling better than ever before. Miraculously, the Lower East Side no longer looked drab. The sidewalks and the buildings seemed to sparkle. And in the early morning before the smog set in, the sky was red and golden. Clearly, what we needed was a guru. In October 1965, we left Newport News on the SS Jaladuta, an Indian freighter bound for Bombay, a month's voyage. When we landed and took our first look at Bombay, Eastern philosophy began to make sense. All life is suffering and must be transcended. But how? Oh, this picture here. When Srila Prabhupada first took us to Puri, there were so many lepers. And so you see here this picture she selected. So we could understand suffering. In this way, adipoetic skin disease. But Keith and I couldn't find any holy men who were both impressive and versed in English. Oh, I have to say that Prabhupada came. If you think of every other saintly person. They all spoke in their own language to their own constituency, their own people. There wasn't a saintly person who went out of their comfort zone and spoke and preached and taught in a foreign language. But Prabhupada went way out of his comfort zone, and he came to speak to us in our language. I spent a year in Baroda trying to learn Sanskrit, and I was so lonely because no one spoke English. And when I got here, I cried at Srila Prabhupada's Samadhi, big, big tears of gratitude that Prabhupada spoke to us in English. He was so kind. He spoke to us in a language that we could understand. So that can't be underestimated. What Prabhupada did, it's unprecedented. It had never happened in the history of mankind. But Keith and I couldn't find any holy men who were both impressive and versed in English. Those who knew English seemed more immersed in temple administration than philosophy or meditation, and the itinerant sadhus with flowing beards seemed remote and uncommunicative. And this is from the Hare Krishna Explosion by Hari Griva Das. We returned to Calcutta, then went to Calcutta. We returned to Delhi, then went to Calcutta, spent a month in Bengal, and disappointed, finally took another freighter back to New York. And now, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami suddenly appears in our backyard. And there were so many of us that I was in Hawaii, and I was enrolled to take Hindi, and I wanted to go to India to go to college. And I was trying to convince my parents to send me to India to go to college because I wanted to study yoga too. But suddenly I met devotees, and Srila Prabhupada came to Hawaii in our own backyard. I didn't have to go anywhere. We were just as he actually went to India in search. And suddenly in our own backyard comes Srila Prabhupada. How kind. We didn't have to go out of our comfort zone at all. Prabhupada came to us. It says, and now A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami suddenly appears in our backyard as if the whole chaotic stage had been deliberately, specifically set for him. When I go alone to see Swami, he seems to be expecting me. Directly and simply, he begins to explain that he needs help in spreading Krishna consciousness around the world. Noticing that he has been typing, I offer to type for him, and he hands me the manuscript of the first chapter, second canto of Vyasadev's Srimad Bhagavatam. In the early days, we were so excited. We were getting chapter by chapter. Sometimes we would just get mimeographed copies. They weren't even printed yet, and we would be reading them. Like, we didn't have like sets and sets of books. We had teachings of Lord Chaitanya and Bhagavad-Gita. And we were reading from Professor Sanyal's teachings of Chaitanya Charitamrita. It hadn't been done yet. So I hate to say it, but when you think about Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur taking 12 years to find literature on Lord Chaitanya, and how we're spoiled rotten and we have everything all at once. Prabhupada gave us everything. He gave us everything. When I go alone to see Swami, he seems to be expecting me. It says, noticing that he has been typing, I offer to type for him, and he hands me the manuscript of the first chapter, second canto of Vyasadev's Srimad Bhagavatam. Also from the Hare Krishna Explosion by Hari Griva Das. Though we're not accustomed to getting up early, Swamiji's magnetism draws us into the nearly deserted 6:30 a.m. streets. In the early days of Krishna consciousness, our classes were early, like we didn't get up and go to the temple at 4:15 or 4:30 like we do now. we stayed on the streets and chanted Hare Krishna till 11 o'clock at night. And so our Mangala was like this, 6:30 in the morning. So these early morning meetings are beautiful and intimate. On any one morning, there are only 8 or 10 of us present, all young, all in our 20s, except 30-year-old Jim Green, a carpenter, teacher at Cooper Union. There is Michael Grant, a pianist, composer, just graduated from Columbia. Steve Gorino, a city social worker. Charles Barnett, fresh out of high school and into Hatha Yoga. Bearded Roy Dubois. I think you were reading exactly this in the Hindi because I'd read some of it earlier and I was hearing the names as he was presenting it in Hindi. The bearded Roy Dubois, a freelance cartoonist and writer. Bill Epstein, a waiter at the Macrobiotic Paradox restaurant. Tall, skinny Stanley, no one knows anything about Stanley, and the Mott Street crew, Keith, Wally, and myself. That's Hari Griva. We all sit cross-legged on the floor in front of Swamiji, who sits behind the tin foot locker. He looks fresh from being awake for hours, because Srila Prabhupada would get up in the wee hours of the morning, and you could hear him translating. And at this point, he didn't even have the dictaphone yet, but he would be speaking into the dictaphone in the wee hours of the morning. And because nothing else is happening, you could overhear Prabhupada speaking into the dictaphone. I think Gargamuni got the dictaphone. Chuck Chutananda, I brought a few grapes and came to the door of the Swami. This was all new. Previously, I would always walk towards McDougal Street, toward Bohemia, aesthetic New York, and now I was walking to the Lower East Side, toward the business district, where there were no freaks, artists, or musicians, but simply straight buildings. And somehow, outside the carnival atmosphere, there was the richest attraction for the senses and the heart. Howard said, I would sing all the way to the foyer, then ring the buzzer marked A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami, and the door would buzz and open, and I would walk through the hallway into the small patio and up to his small second-floor apartment, tiptoeing quietly as to not wake up the neighbors. Prabhupada was very considerate, and when in Hawaii, when Srila Prabhupada was there, we were very quiet. If we were coming in our vehicles, we would shut the door very quietly. Everything we did very quietly. Even our chanting, we were quiet about it. Because Prabhupada, he could hear everything. Chuck came into the hall of his building and there were many, many names printed on the plaques over the mailboxes. I immediately found the name A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami handwritten on a slip of torn paper, slipped into one of the slots. I rang the buzzer and waited. After a few moments, the door buzzed loudly and I entered through the security lot. I walked through the small garden into the rear building and upstairs. Prabhupada held his classes for almost 2 months in the privacy of his room, the same room where he typed and talked to guests. To Keith, it was not simply a class in philosophy, but a mystical experience of sweetness. Prabhupada always, like in the early days when we would come, we had Harinam Sankirtan in the evenings, Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays, and Bhagavad-Gita class Monday, Wednesdays, Friday, and the Sunday feast on Sunday. So we, in the evening after class, Prabhupada would he would give us pieces of cut fruit and puris with sugar. So you could get a fruit with the puri. It was like such a delicacy. You know, for us, we had never had anything like that. Keith, the sound of his voice, the sun coming up, we'd chant for a few minutes, softly clapping hands, and Swamiji would speak. The thing that got me most was simply the sound of his voice, especially while he was chanting Sanskrit. It was like music to my ears to hear him speak the raw sound. I think all of us were mesmerized by Srila Prabhupada's voice. First, we had to get accustomed to understanding his particular accent, but the booming, the resonance of Srila Prabhupada's, I've never heard a voice ever again that ever matched or sounded like the timbre of Srila Prabhupada's voice. So as to not disturb the neighbors, Prabhupada would say, chant softly, and he asked the boys to clap softly, so softly that their hands barely touched. Then he would chant the prayers to the spiritual master. Samsara Davan Alalita Loka. The spiritual master is receiving benediction from the ocean of mercy, just as a cloud pours water on a forest fire to extinguish it, so the spiritual master extinguishes the blazing fire of material existence. With his eyes closed, he sang softly in the dim morning light. The few who attended, Keith, Howard, Chuck, Steve, Wally, sat entranced. Never before had the Swami been so appreciated. Can you imagine? Some probably unwashed hippie boys, but some of them were teachers and professors. There were quite a few actual professors that came to Srila Prabhupada. Scholars. Chuck, the Swami was sitting there, and in the mornings, he would look not shiny and brilliant, but very withdrawn. He looked as if he could sit like a stone, maybe forever. His eyes were only two shiny slits of glistening light. He took out his cymbals and played lightly on the edge, 1, 2, 3, and he began to sing in a deep voice that was almost atonal in its intervals. Now, Achyutananda or Chuck is a consummate musician, so he studied Srila Prabhupada, each and every mannerism and the tone, and he's a musician. And so he was very careful and he emulated. He was the first one who started to do the Bengali bhajans, and the pronouncing properly, because we mispronounced everything badly in the early days. Our names were mispronounced. It was just, we didn't really understand the diacritics yet. We were learning, and Prabhupada was very kind to us, very, very kind to us. It was a melody, monotone, that did not express happiness or sadness, a timeless chant that told no story. We chanted along with him as best we could, but several times Swamiji stopped and said, softly. After about 30 minutes of chanting, we stopped. Then he opened his eyes wider and said, we must chant softly because sometimes the neighbors are complaining. And this happened a lot. In the old days, we were out on Harinam. We would undergo tremendous trial and tribulation. They would throw tomatoes at us. Sometimes they'd throw buckets of water on us. We would be persecuted. They would call us bala heads and all kinds of things, in the early days, because they didn't really understand that we were an ancient religion. And so Prabhupada was he was also very concerned that we didn't undergo these kinds of persecutions. But we were also anarchists by nature. We were rebellious, so it didn't bother us that much that we weren't being, appreciated. It didn't bother us at all, actually. It made us more determined. About 30 minutes in the chanting, we stopped, and he opened his eyes wider and said, "We must chant softly because sometimes the neighbors are complaining." After singing, the Swami would give one of the boys a copy of Dr. Radhakrishna's edition of the Bhagavad-Gita to read aloud from. He would correct their mispronunciations and then explain each verse. Because there were only a few people present, there were always ample time for everyone to discuss the philosophy. The class would sometimes run an hour and a half and cover 3 or 4 verses. In the old days, you often saw devotees imitating Srila Prabhupada, literally imitating him. When they would give class, Prabhupada had these really graceful hand motions, and he would clear his voice. And they were young men, but they would do each and every little thing exactly like Srila Prabhupada. They'd clear their voice, and they would make these graceful hand motions. And there's a saying that mimicry is a fond form of flattery. So as young children that we were, teenagers that we were, so many of the fellows would imitate Srila Prabhupada as if they were gracious and as if they had some phlegm to clear in their throat, because everything Prabhupada did was enchanting. We were literally enchanted by his manner. His divine grace is real. When we say his divine grace, it's because he truly is his divine grace. He had all that grace. You can hear over and over and over and over by everyone. They'll tell you it's as if he didn't even touch the ground. You'll hear that over and over again. There was such a otherworldly aura around Srila Prabhupada, and even my great aunt said, "Wow, he's huge. His aura is huge." Even my great aunt, who was much elderly, probably around his age, she recognized his amazingness even. So okay, here we go. The class would sometimes run an hour and a half and cover 3 or 4 verses. Steve said Swamiji mentioned that mangoes were the king of all fruits, and he even mentioned that they were not easily available in this country. It occurred to me that I could bring him mangoes. There was a store on First Avenue that always kept a fresh stock of mangoes in the cooler, and I began a regular habit. Every day after getting off work, I would purchase one nice mango and bring it to Swamiji. And Prabhupada wrote us a letter in Hawaii, and he said, "I will come during mango season and eat only mangoes and milk." And we used to actually send Prabhupada boxes of mangoes wherever he was in the world. And we would mark on it photographic equipment on the side, because it was about the heaviness of photographic equipment, and we just didn't want it to be, we used to handle with care. And there's one story in Mayapur, Prabhupada ate one of the mangoes that we had sent, and he said, "This was a very good mango." And he gave the seed to Tapamoya, and he said, "Plant it." And that tree only just got removed to build the temple. Yeah, just before that tree was an amazing tree that bore fruit, like amazing fruit. So it was one of the miracles, actually, one of the miracles. And when we heard about it later, when we went to Mayapur, we heard that Prabhupada received a box of mangoes from Hawaii. And, you would hear about, like, the story continues, you get to hear the other parts to it, that he grew a tree from that seed. Wally, some of the boys would say, "I'm doing this for the Swami." So I went to him and said, "Is there something I can do for you?" So he told me I could take notes in his class. The boys were sure that their service to Swamiji was spiritual, devotional service. By serving the spiritual master who was a representative of Krishna, you were serving Krishna directly. One morning, Srila Prabhupada told Howard that he needed help in spreading the philosophy of Krishna consciousness. Howard wanted to help, so he offered to type Swamiji's manuscripts of Bhagavad-Gita. Howard, the first words of the first verse read, "O the king," and naturally I wondered whether O was the king's name or the king, stood in opposition. After some time I figured out that O king was intended instead. I didn't make the correction without his permission. "Yes," he said, "change it then." I began to point out a few changes and inform him that if he wanted I could make corrections, that I had a master's degree in English and taught last year at Ohio State University. "Oh yes," Swamiji said, "do it. Put it nicely." He was giving them the idea of devotional service. A devotee may not be perfect at first, he said, but if he is engaged in service, once that service is begun, he can be purified. Service is always there, in the material world or the spiritual. But service in the material world could not bring satisfaction to the self. Only bhakti, purified service, service rendered to Krishna, could do that. And the best way to serve Krishna was to serve the representative of Krishna. Actually, Harigriva's work with Srila Prabhupada, he worked very closely with Srila Prabhupada, and the way in which he would write things was poetic. And the Bhagavatam is poetic. If you look at the Chaitanya Charitamrita, it's so poetic. The words are just dripping with meaning and grace and love. You know, the scriptures are written. They're truly divinely inspired. As I retype another paragraph, I notice certain grammatical discrepancies, perhaps typical of Bengalis who learn English from British headmasters in the early 1900s. And also consider there's archaic English and there's British English. It's not US English. It's a little different. So all these things considered. There were some words Srila Prabhupada used that were archaic. It was ancient, old English. On occasion, someone will even correct my English, and I go back and look it up, and I'll see I'm using an archaic word. Because in Hawaii, the original, there was a Bostonian King's English spoken. It was like a British English. So when I go to other places in the US, they correct me because I'm using an archaic use of the word. And once Brahmananda, he corrected Srila Prabhupada, and then he looked it up. Prabhupada was correct. He wasn't wrong. You know, Prabhupada was correct in his usage. So Prabhupada was teaching us. Considerable editing is required to get the text to conform with current American usage. After pointing out a few changes, I tell the Swami that if he so desired, I could make all the proper corrections. "Very good," he said, smiling. "Do it. Put it nicely." Thus my editorial service began. I type all morning in the room where he reads, translates, welcomes visitors, and takes rest. There is a tin footlocker used as his desk and a rug on which he sits sometimes and sometimes sleeps. Apart from my typewriter table, there is no other furniture. From With Srila Prabhupada in the Early Days, 1966 to 1969, a memoir by Satsvarup Das Goswami. In the introduction, Prabhupada apologizes for these material errors, but because the message of Srimad Bhagavatam is so urgent, the book will be appreciated by honest persons despite mistakes. He even quotes a verse from the scripture to support this and gives the example that if there is a fire in the house, one will be able to inform the residents of the emergency, even if he does not speak their language. And I also would like to add, if you look at things that are handmade, there's always some flaw. And if you look at real gemstones, there's always some flaw. It's like a birthmark. If you look at artificial things, AI, everything is flawless. But the character and the authenticity and the genuineness and the beauty is in the handmade, original, loving thing. It's not some artificial, factory, industrialized, mass-produced thing. That's not really that beautiful. It can be functional, very functional. So all you have to do is go to Prem Mandir and see how they copied Prabhupada's Samadhi, but they did it with machine-cut Italian marble, and it looks like pixels. It's so squarey. It's not graceful like we have handmade, hand done with love, authentic. Srila Prabhupada's Samadhi is authentic. People think they can improve upon it by putting it in a machine and making it work. But so these little discrepancies, like Prabhupada would call his toes fingers, they're very endearing. They're like your heart melts. You actually like to see those things. It's real. It's super real. And we never thought anything to find fault with it at all. It was just beautiful. This explanation made me sympathetic, and soon the very printing mistakes, the crude brick color cover, and the use of phrases like the Lord and the Supreme Personality of Godhead and Krishna began to increase my interest in reading the book. I took the book with me and read it whenever I went on the bus, in my apartment, or even at my office desk. From the preface, Srimad Bhagavatam, first canto, by His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada, I must admit my frailties in presenting Srimad Bhagavatam, for still I am hopeful of its good reception by the thinkers and leaders of society on the strength of the following statement of Srimad Bhagavatam 1.5.11. Can somebody read the Sanskrit? I'll read it in English. On the other hand, that literature which is full of descriptions of the transcendental glories of the name, fame, forms, and pastimes of the unlimited Supreme Lord is a different creation, full of transcendental words directed towards bringing about a revolution in the impious lives of this world's misdirected civilization. Such transcendental literatures, even though imperfectly composed, are heard, sung, and accepted by purified men who are thoroughly honest. That is so important, thorough honesty. It's all we have left is honesty. Umapati Das in the early days, they picked it up quickly. It was something that you could do easily. It was not difficult like meditation. It was an activity. You did something, but you did it for Krishna. They had seen Swamiji respond to the Bowery bum who had come with a gift of toilet paper. Just see, Swamiji had said, he is not in order, but he thought, let me do some service. When I think about what happened in COVID in the West, everybody was fighting over toilet paper. It was crazy. It was so hard to get toilet paper. So in light of that, this Bowery bum giving Prabhupada, it was what he thought was important. It seems as though this is what the whole civilization is thinking is important, toilet paper. So in his mind, he was doing something nice, He says, but that service had to be done voluntarily out of love, not by force. Wali, Swamiji once asked me, do you think you could wear the Vaishnav tilak when you are on the streets? I said, well, I would feel funny doing it, but if you want me to, I will. And Swamiji said, no, I don't ask you to do anything you don't want to do. But eventually we wanted to do everything that Prabhupada was doing. You know, he even taught us how to put on a sari. Can you imagine? You know, because how were we going to learn to put on a sari? Prabhupada had to show us how to do it. Steve, one day when I brought my daily mango to him, he was in his room surrounded by devotees. I gave him my mango and sat down, and he said, "Very good boy," the way he said it, as if I were just a tiny little boy, made everyone in the room laugh, and I felt foolish. But we all felt like boys and girls around Prabhupada. He called us his boys and girls, you know. We thought we were grown-ups, but to Srila Prabhupada, we were boys and girls, you know. So Swamiji said, however, then changed their mood by saying, "No, this is actually love. This is Krishna consciousness." And then they didn't laugh. When Howard first volunteered to do editing, he spent the whole morning working in Swamiji's room. "If there is any more typing," Howard said, "let me know. I could take it back to Mott Street and type there." "More? There's lots more," Swamiji said. He opened the closet and pulled out 2 big bundles of manuscripts tied in saffron cloth. There were thousands of pages, single-space manuscript of Prabhupada's translations of the Srimad Bhagavatam. Howard stood before them, astonished. "It's a lifetime of typing." Unlimited service. He said. Srila Prabhupada smiled and said, "Oh yes, many lifetimes, because of Prabhupada's presence and the words that he spoke there and the kirtanas." Everyone was already referring to the storefront as the temple. But still it was just a bare, squalid storefront. The inspiration to decorate the place came from the Mott Street boys. Howard, Keith, and Wally devised a scheme to surprise the Swami when he came to the evening kirtan. Wally removed the curtains from their apartment, took them to the laundromat, where they turned the water dark brown from filth and then dyed them purple. The Mott Street apartment was decorated with posters, paintings, and large decorative silk hangings that Howard and Keith had brought back from India. The boys gathered up all their pictures, tapestries, incense burners, and other paraphernalia and took them, along with the purple curtains, to the storefront, where they began their day of decorating. You can just see, it's so interesting because it may not have been their exact nature, but still they wanted to please Srila Prabhupada by any manner. So they're looking around just to see what can they do for the pleasure of Prabhupada. At the storefront, the boys constructed a wooden platform for Prabhupada to sit on and covered it with old velvet cloth. Behind the platform, on the rear wall between the 2 windows to the courtyard, they hung the purple curtains, flanked by a pair of orange ones. Against one orange panel, just above Swamiji's sitting place, they hung a large original painting of Radha and Krishna on a circular canvas that John Green had done. Prabhupada had commissioned James, giving him the dust jacket from his Srimad Bhagavatam with its crude Indian drawing as a model. The figures of Radha and Krishna were somewhat abstract, but the Lower East Side critics who frequented the storefront hailed the work as a wonderful achievement. Yeah, I'd have to say that the art, ISKCON art, it got better and better and better. The artists, they became truly empowered. What started out as simplistic, almost village art became like masterpiece art, like Leonardo da Vinci type art, just super excellent. Keith and Howard were less confident that Prabhupada would approve of their paintings and prints from India, so they hung them near the street side of the temple, away from Swamiji's seat. One of these prints, well known in India, was of Hanuman carrying a mountain through the sky to Lord Ramachandra. The boys had no idea what kind of being Hanuman was. They thought perhaps he was a cat because of the shape of his upper lip. Then there was the picture of a male person with 6 arms, 2 arms painted greenish, held a bow and an arrow, another pair bluish, held a flute, and a third pair, golden, held a stick and a bow. We didn't know anything. We knew nothing. When I first saw the pictures of Krishna in Autobiography of a Yogi, I started painting pictures of Krishna. I thought he was a girl. I did not know. And so I was drawing pictures of Krishna all the time before I even met the devotees and saying, Krishna, 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 sounds so beautiful, so beautiful. But Prabhupada had to teach us what was real. He had to fine-tune our understanding. Just see, we didn't even know who is Satbuj. By late afternoon, they had covered the sitting platform, hung the curtains, tacked up the decorative silks and prints, and hung the paintings, and were decorating the dais with flowers and candlesticks. Someone brought a pillow for Swamiji to sit on and a faded cushion from an overstuffed chair for a backrest, in addition to the Mott Street catch. Robert Nelson took one of his grandfather's Belgian-style oriental rugs from his garage in the suburbs and brought it by subway to 26 2nd Avenue. Even Raphael and Don took part in the decorating. So this sounds like, you've all heard the story of stone soup? There's a story where it's something like Padayatra. You go into a village and you say, okay, let's make a feast, let's make a festival. But nobody has anything. He says, well, we have this magic stone, and just bring a pot of water, and anybody can bring anything, and we can just put this into the soup. And people get a little curious, and they bring this and that, and all of a sudden, like, the whole place is majorly decorated because someone's bringing a little something from everywhere. It's just really stone soup. And what happens in the end, because everybody's contributed, there's a wonderful pot of soup. This person has vegetables growing in their garden, another person has potatoes, and pretty soon you have a very nice opulent soup. It's a story of stone soup. And that is and Prabhupada says, many hands make light work. So if everybody does a little something, then it becomes rich and magical. And it's congregational devotional service, congregational chanting. We're begging for service. And you could see these boys just automatically began to serve Srila Prabhupada in this lovely way. Uh-oh, are we at the end? No more. I think that's our last one. Okay, to be continued. She gave me 23 slides, and I was supposed to talk enough to fill it in, but unfortunately I thought I had too much to say, but not enough. There's never enough glorification of Srila Prabhupada. Does anybody have any questions or anything to add? You must. Hare Krishna. All glorious to Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Hare Hare Bo, Hare Krishna.